uh,
Sorry.
Standing at the last moment. And I shall hand over now to Tessa to introduce Jane to the meeting. Thank you.
Hello. So I was really interested to read about Jane's background. I worked as a careers advisor in my distant past, and it was always amazing to hear the career changes. I worked with adults, so it was interesting to hear the amazing changes that people made. Jane grew up on a farm on the west of Scotland and then went to Dundee to do a degree in dentistry. But from there, she managed to move sideways into working into doing a master's in environmental and forest management at Aberdeen University, and then got her current job in Plants for Life. And she's going to speak to us tonight on, you tell us, Jane, what you're going to do.
I'm going to be speaking about the project I work on at Trees for Life, which is called the Wild Pine Project.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's
Great.
you.
I will share my screen, hopefully. Is that coming up okay?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so I'm Jane. You'll hear from my accent that it was the west of Ireland that I grew up in. Um, and I'm gonna speak to tonight about the Wild Pine Project, and it is looking at finding the forgotten Caledonian Pinewood fragments. I've been working in the project since 2023, and it's probably just my dream job if I could have made something up for a for a job description. This is pretty much it. So tonight I'm going to go through what Caledonian Pinewood is, the work that's gone before the Wild Pine Project, a bit about the project and what we aim to do with it, how we look at the potential wild pine sites and how we investigate them. And I'll give you some examples of the sites. And we'll look at what the findings are so far and the threats that these places face. So what is wild pine basically? It is Caledonian pinewood. But this photo shows the difference between planted and wild pine population. So the island on the left is what you would look at and think that is wild pine. The woodland has structural diversity, and it has lots of different ages of trees, and that's versus the island on the right, which was planted about 150 years ago. And you can see that the planted population are quite structurally homogeneous, even when they're planted so long ago. So wild pine are generated through natural regeneration and colonization. They have variable density and form, and they have ecological continuity, which goes back to the last ice age. And that means that they're really good refuges for biodiversity, including specialist species. And even with small populations, research shows that there's still really good genetic variation within these groups of pine. So together, these pine and the rest of the woodland species that they're associated with form Caledonian pinewood habitat, which is one of our richest habitats. So to take a look back through the history of pinewood documentation, the first people to document pine woods were Stephen and Carlisle back in the 1950s, and they published their book, The Native Pine Woods of Scotland, and they included 35 sites when they wrote this book. Then in the 1990s, the Forestry Commission had another look at this, and they came up with 84 sites in the Caledonian Pinewood inventory, and this is nationally recognised. And then in 2023, James Rainey at Trees for Life published the findings from the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project. And this was a survey carried out over 4 years across these sites, and it found that 23% of our pinewoods are critically endangered. So next in line is the Wild Pine Project, and this is the successor to the Caledonian Pinewood Project. The Wild Pine Project is at the minute a 3-year project, hopefully to be extended, and it's in partnership with the Woodland Trust. It's funded through the People's Postcode Lottery and through Tread Right Foundation and Trees for Life. And we have initially focused on the rainforest zone because of the way the funding's structured. So the overall aim of the project is to identify, survey, and map Caledonian pinewood that has previously been missed off the official inventory. And we hope this information will be used to preserve, protect, and proliferate Caledonian pinewoods in the future. And this is sort of how it's come about. So potential wild pine sites have been identified through field work, and that's during the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project that James did, but also one of the surveyors, Alistair Firth, who worked on the Native Woodland Survey of Scotland. But a huge help for identifying these sites is the historical mapping that we have access to through the National Library of Scotland. So what we're looking for in these historical maps is to locate conifer symbols where they're scattered in the landscape or intermixed with broadleaf symbols on the map. And we'll come back to this a bit later. So this aerial shows the existing Caledonian pinewood. That's the green with the yellow outline. And it's alongside potential wild pine sites, which are the pink dots. And the area outlined in purple is the rainforest zone. So potential sites aren't limited to those that are found here. And as we progress, we're probably going to add a lot more to the east this year. And it's also probably important to say just that these are not all wild pine sites. These are just ones that we're looking to investigate through the project. So this is what a typical wild pine site looks like. This is on the east side of Loch Etive, Corrylotha, and the trees and the associated vegetation have retreated into the gorge, and that's out of the reach of browsing and grazing, and the land around remains treeless and lacks diversity. A lot of the sites are typically small and the trees are just about clinging on, but wild pine sites are very variable. We have some really huge sites, but many that are quite similar to this one. So I'm just going to go through what we look at whenever we're investigating a site. So to decide whether pine populations are likely to be of wild or planted origin, we consider 3 main pieces of evidence. First is historical, and we ask, is there historical evidence of wild pine populations, and is there evidence of continuity with these historical populations? The second is ecological. So do the ecological characteristics of the site match up to those of a typical wild pine site? And if they don't, why do they not? And lastly is the landscape context. So given the historical, ecological and topographic context of the site and the surrounding landscape, does it make sense that a wild pine population could have persisted, or could planting or colonization from a planted population provide a better explanation for the presence of pine? I just want to point out this tree. This is probably my favourite tree of the project so far. It's a really ancient pine. in one of the sites we'll look at a bit later, but it's hollow inside and it's kind of like got a dead branch that looks a bit like a walking stick. I think it sort of looks like it's like an old man, an old man tree with a walking stick. I really loved that tree. So I'm going to go through each bit of the site assessment. So firstly was the historical evidence. What we're mainly using for this is the statistical accounts for Scotland and old maps. And the first edition Ordnance Survey map that you see on the right here from the 1800s are particularly useful. It's when mapping became a lot more accurate at fine scale. And hopefully you'll see the conifer symbols here, and they're intermixed with broadleaf woodland. And where historical research has been a bit trickier, where the mapping hasn't been as accurate or places have been overlooked in the statistical accounts, we have commissioned specialist research to help build a clearer picture. So to have a look at the historical evidence gathering process, I'm going to just run through this site. It's known as Glenfionley, and we'll look at some old maps and ask the population if this pine population is wild. So this is a recent aerial of the site, and it shows scattered woodland on the southeast side of the Fionley River, and it's opposite plantation forestry, and also at the top right hand of the image as well. So go back to the 1800s. This is the first edition Ordnance Survey map, and it shows intermixed broadleaf conifer symbols in the same place that we see aerial imagery of the woodland. Go back again to the 1700s, and this is after the Jacobite Rebellion, whenever the forfeited estates were mapped, and it shows again woodland in the same places. We go back further, and this is a map from the 1500s. This is the Pont maps, and they didn't show detail for the area, but there are texts that go along with these maps. And in the text for Glenfionley, it says there is plenty of great firwood, but difficult to transport. And firwood is a term used historically for pinewood. So the woodland can be traced back through time using the maps and text available. So historical evidence at Glenfionley is really strong. And this is what's on the ground today in terms of existing pine. So the dots represent pine tree. Red dots are dead, yellow dots are mature, and green dots are maturing trees. So we found 108 Scots pine trees here, and they're mostly in the mature or senescent stages of their lives. And they're alongside broadleaf tree species and associated woodland indicator species. So we're quite confident that the ecological and the historical evidence here at Glenfionley adds up to show this site is genuine wild pine, Caledonian pinewood. And this is where historical and ecological evidence kind of crosses over. So here we're taking tree cores for dendrochronology analysis, and some of the trees have been cored at Glenfionley, and many of the living pine today are dating back to the 1600s. And this method of evidence gathering can be really useful in the places where we don't have that documentation of the site in terms of the maps or the texts. So we've done historical. The next part of the assessment is ecological evidence. So there's a bespoke survey methodology for the Wild Pine Project, and it's being developed at Trees for Life by James Rainey, and it takes into account the woodland as a whole, not just the pine trees. So it's in the form of plots every 2 hectares and transects along watercourses, as well as recording any individual pine trees and looking at other indicator species. So just in total, kind of what we're looking at is tree abundance, tree age, structure of the species of those trees, natural regeneration of tree species, and herbivore impacts. And then we also look at the diversity at the site in terms of what we refer to as refugial species. And these are woodland indicator plants, tall herbs, things like lichen species, bryophyte species, and wood ants as well. And these things show that there's woodland continuity over time. So you get to know sort of leaves quite well because the survey's going over 6 months. So you can't rely on things being in flower. So it's quite a good way of learning leaves. So as well as all of that, we look for stumps. So stumps where they occur outside of peatlands. We know from previous research that the stumps that we find in peatland date back to around 4,000 years ago. But what we're interested in is the stumps that have come about more recently. In a natural woodland, when pine trees die, they typically blow over and uproot, and sometimes it can remain standing as pine bones. So the assumption is that stumps that are found on these slopes, which are upright and where there's no sign of the rest of the tree, have been felled at some point within the last 100 years or so. I'm just going to go off on a bit of a tangent here because we have done a sort of a little trial with St Andrews University to look at the pine stumps and see if we can date them. So this isn't something that has been done for these stumps before, and we hope to get a PhD student on them. So I've gone out with a contractor and he has cut some discs from these pine stumps. So they're sanded down, and there has been a preliminary assessment of the data. So they've gone off to St Andrews Uni, and some of these samples here, one of these that Yanis here is cut in, it dates back to the 1500s, and this preliminary data is quite surprising because we're aware of lots of felling that's gone on in the 1700s and 1800s in these places, but it was really surprising to see that the outer rings of a lot of these trees are coming up in the 1500s and the 1400s as well. So there's obviously a lot of extraction that has gone on in the past, and we hope that a PhD project can take this forward and have a look at lots more sites. So that was the ecological evidence. We're going to have a look just lastly at landscape context. And what we do here is we take the historical and ecological findings together and take into account things like site aspect and where the closest Caledonian Pinewood inventory site is. So is it already in the landscape? And we take a look at the wider woodland that's present as well, and things like this birchwood on the right that's kind of on its last legs is the sort of typical woodland picture in these landscapes a lot of the time. So we bring all the evidence together and we weigh it up to decide how likely it is that a site is well pine or not, and we want to make the decision as robust as possible. So this is sort of the project progress so far. These are the sites that we have investigated. We've sort of grouped them together now so that they match up with the Caledonian Pinewood inventory. So over the course of survey work, we've recorded data from plots covering 1,500 hectares and transects covering 140 kilometres of watercourse habitat as well. So I just want to run through some sites as well. This is a wild pine site called Cruile Corrianoan near Spain Bridge, and it's part of a larger complex known as Lenakin. So these are 3 old pine trees found in the site, and you can see quite a variable form to the trees. So that's a typical indicator of wild pine. There's lots of different sizes, lots of different shapes. They all sort of have their own character. And where the trees are growing as well can tell us about their origin. They are, at this site in general, restricted to ledges, like on the left, or the edge of the Carr waterfall that you can see on the right. And they've survived here probably due to their inaccessibility and the locations where they're growing. And this is the area of Cuilecorrianoan. So to start the historical evidence for here, the earliest record of woodland in the wider area is on the Roy maps, which are the 1700s. So there's just some woodland up in this area here, but it's not specifically on Cuilecorrianoan. This is Aaron Arrowsmith map of the same area from the 1800s. It's not particularly accurate for upland areas, but again, you've got a little bit of woodland shown on the map. So we do know that there is record of woodland in this area. This was quite an interesting map to find because it's a sales map. So in 1840, George Campbell Smith produced an estate map for the sale of land at Inverlochy Castle, and this includes Leanican. And there are mixed conifer and broadleaf symbols on this map, which depict the woodland at Leanican. So to contextualize the significance of this, almost all the woodlands on the map are depicted as broadleaves only, with Cuilia Leanican only being one of only 2 on the map that had conifer symbols added into it. So they have made that distinction to show that there are different types of woodland on this sales map. I'll go to the 1860s. On the first edition Ordnance Survey map, the conifer symbols are present in the Leanican area. There's just a few along the edges up here. It's maybe not come out very well on the screen, but there are some conifer symbols in the Leanican complex, and they're intermixed with lots of broadleaf woodland. So Cuilecorrianoan itself on this map is depicted only as broadleaf woodland, but the expected size and the age of the pine trees found on the survey, which we looked at the photos earlier for, indicate that they were present at the time of mapping this, but they weren't individually mapped. So this is the sort of overlooking in the mapping. So there is I don't know if I'd say a lack of historical evidence because there's good historical evidence for woodland, but it's not entirely clear about pine woodland at Cuilecorrianoan. So landscape context and ecological evidence point to poor historical documentation of woodland rather than a true absence of pine wood here. And potentially, if you had time to go to National Archives and things like that, there would be something that you could pick up on that would give you more historical evidence for this area. So in the ecological survey, there were lots of old pines, lots of old birch, lots of old growth trees and variable density of woodland. Again, it's one of these places that's kind of dying off. It's got birch woodland on its last legs. And we found lots of stumps here as well. So we know that pine stumps in this area, pine was once more widespread in this woodland historically. And this is kind of looking at it in the landscape context. So the green is ancient woodland, yellow is plantation on an ancient woodland site, and then there are other bits of semi-natural woodland in pink. So Cuilecorrianoan is within a landscape with lots of ancient woodland and Gaelic place names, which is a really important part of the process as well. We know that where there are anglicised names, there's generally been more sort of interference with woodland or cultivation and things in the past as well. So the way the woodlands are depicted on the first edition Ordnance Survey is consistent with the woodlands being natural and not planted. There's also no sort of big houses in the area, which tend to be associated with plantation woodlands as well. So that's another thing we look out for in the landscape. And just over to the west of Cuile Corrynoan is Glen Nevis CPI site as well. So the pine are found on a north-facing aspect. This is a general trend for pine woods, not always the case, I want to point out, but they generally tend to be on north-facing aspects because the soil doesn't develop as much in these places, and the woodland can't progress into sort of a richer woodland with ash and oak and elm and hazel and species like that. But they do cling on to sort of craggy bits on south-facing slopes as well. So everything together for this site show that there's no indication of planting has taken place. And these dots are the pine. So you can see how many dead pine that we've found here. There are only 6 established pine, but there were 57 pine stumps outside of peat, and the evidence comes together to show that Cuile Corrynoan is a genuine Caledonian pine site. So I'm just going to take a look at what we've found so far. We are kind of halfway through, and we've summed up our evidence so far in an interim report, and these are the main findings. So most of the sites are relics of larger pine woods. The relic pine woods still retain high levels of ecological diversity. All sites are threatened and some will be lost without urgent action, and most sites have good potential for natural recovery. So I want to have a look at these findings just again with showing you a site. So this is the site with the old man with the walking stick tree. It's called Camderry, which means crooked wood. And these are the pines. The dots are the pines. Red is dead. And you can just see 2 old pines here and here. So the really nice tree is just down here. So lots of pine stumps. And this is where we did the stump trial for St Andrews Uni as well. And this is just highlighting that most sites are relics of larger pine woods. So you can see that it was once pine made up a greater population within this woodland at one time, more than what it is today. Relic pine woods still retain high levels of ecological diversity. We're sticking with Camderry here, and the dots here, the brighter and the bigger they are, so the more orangey coloured they are, show that there's more of these refugial species that we look at. So these X's and tiny yellow dots are showing very little diversity in this open hill. But if you look along the watercourse, that's where we have these bigger, brighter dots, and that's showing that the diversity here has retreated into these watercourses where you've got ledges and steep ravines and gullies where things are allowed to cling on out of the pressure of browsing and grazing. And we found 35 refugial species at Camderry and loads of wood ants nests. So these are some of the things we found. We have Lobarina scribiculata on willow, Tilia crescensis, or ostrich plume feather moss, and this is one of the wood ants nests as well. We found 11 wood ants nests. So the third finding from the interim report is that all sites are threatened and some will be lost without urgent action. And this is always the map that I do that sort of makes me very sad, because what it's showing, so each circle is a pie chart. If there's nothing in it, it means that no trees were found in that plot or transect. If there's only red or orange, it means there were only dead trees or senescent trees that were found within that plot or transect. And then green and yellow are younger trees. So the plots cover where we would expect woodland to be from the historical maps. So you can see that so many of these don't have any trees left already, but where we are finding trees that are outside the watercourse, they are old or dead. So this woodland is slowly retreating just into those inaccessible areas, and it will be lost without action. And that action is for deer. So deer densities are far too high to sustain woodland in much of the country, really. So these are typical findings where we have regenerating trees. They are there, but they are just being eaten to bits. So we're finding quite high levels of herbivore impact in lots of places. These photos are a mixture of sites, and this is something that we see regularly as well with pine, is this bark stripping, and often it's stripped the whole way around, so it's ring barked, and that kills the tree. So even older trees aren't sort of safe from deer. And again, this is a reason for lots of these birch woods that are dying off in the landscape as well. Just really heavy browsing pressure. And this is an electricity pole. But you can see down here that it's been rubbed by deer. It looks like almost like a beaver's been at it. So it's an endangered electricity pole. And one of the other threats, which can be very prominent in sites, is plantations. So some of the sites are what we call plantation on ancient woodland sites, where ancient woodland has been removed, and generally non-native conifer species have been planted for timber. And what happens there is that the surrounding conifer timber species shade out our native trees if they have been allowed to remain on the site and haven't been cut down already. And this is a site that's very prominent for this. This is a plantation on an ancient woodland site, and the top two photos, you can see the amazing diversity at this site. So where it's craggy and out of reach and hasn't been able to be planted, we've got loads of diversity, lots of native species at this site in particular. There were 80 of our refugial species recorded, but just beside these areas are trees like this. We have a pine and an oak that have died off because of the overshading of the timber species. So the crags and the ravines are the refuges and the hotspots for diversity. And this is just another impact of deer as well. Sometimes the deer densities are high enough to do this. This is actually the edge of a Caledonian Pinewood inventory site where the trampling is just pretty amazing. Even in such a dry summer as last summer, I was shin deep in muck. So yeah, just super high herbivore impacts. And the last finding from the interim report is that most sites have good potential for natural recovery, despite what we're finding. There really is great potential if we make the management interventions to allow that. So we're back to Camderry here, where we had a look at the refugial species and the old and dying trees that are retreating into the watercourse. So natural regeneration at Camderry was found to be extensive and significant. The dots here, the bigger the dot and the darker the dot, the more wild tree regeneration is happening in those subplots. So in 48% of the subplots, we found wild trees regenerating naturally. And the average density for the whole site is 494 seedlings per hectare. And that equates to over 47,000 trees that are just sitting, waiting for deer pressure to come down so that they're allowed to grow. And if they were allowed to grow, it would increase the density of woodland here by a factor of 70, and it would increase the diversity of tree species 4.5 times. And that's only the start of the process as well. If this was allowed to continue for a long time, this woodland would recover further and move out from where it's constrained to at the minute. So that's really what we want to focus on, is this potential for natural recovery. It's the aim of the Wild Pine Project. But without the knowledge of these places, that's not going to be possible. So that's why we need the Wild Pine Project. And the ecological survey that we do gathers evidence that can be used to make recommendations for landscape recovery. We know from research and evidence in the field that a small population of pine can still recover and have a genetically diverse population, and that's alongside the wider woodland recovery, all the tree species, all of the associated species, flora and fauna. And this is just showing a site at Dundonald where, although the trees are still confined to that ravine side, it's an example of where only a handful of old pines have allowed many more younger pines to regenerate and to begin to mature. So it's just showing that it is possible. And this is the ultimate goal. This is in Straths Bay. We've got diversity, we have continuity, mobility, and connectivity in the landscape. The trees are free to start colonizing upslope as the climate changes. We've got loads of different age trees, lots of natural regeneration, and mixed species as well, and really good connectivity in the landscape. So yeah, without knowing about the wild pine sites to start with, we can't do anything about their future health and resilience. And what the Wild Pine Project is the first step in this process. So just to recap, we have looked at what Caledonian Pinewood is, what's gone before the Wild Pine Project, what the project is and what it aims to do, how we investigate the sites and some examples of those, and what we've found so far and the threats. And I mentioned at the start just about how it is pretty much my dream job, and I get to enjoy surveying these places alongside some great people. So this James, my manager at Trees for Life, James Rainey, and I've been out with some of the NTS staff. This is James McGurk and Alan Crawford, and this is Alistair Firth, who was part of the Native Woodland Survey of Scotland, who now works for RSPB. And I get to explore some beautiful places and see some beautiful things. And this is Lesser Twayblade, which I always love finding. It's so pretty and delicate. And this is another sort of mega tree that I found in Barrasdale. It's a juniper. It's kind of fallen over, so it's uprooted and it's got birch growing out of it, and it's also leaning on another birch tree. So I decided to measure it, measure the girth. So it was 150 centimeters girth. So it has actually gone down as the largest juniper in the UK, and just growing in such like difficult conditions, just an amazing thing to see. So yeah, that is pretty much it, and thanks everybody for listening. Has anybody got questions?
You mentioned regeneration. Is that natural regeneration? Do deer have to be excluded for that to happen, or?
No, natural regeneration will still take place within the presence of high deer densities. It's just that they're sort of kept at a really low level, so they're kept at a field layer level, and a lot of the broadleaf species are quite good at putting up with that pressure over a long period of time. The problem for pine is that it just doesn't really put up with as much of that pressure, so it doesn't survive as well. In some places where maybe deer densities aren't as high as others, deer will be a lot more selective. So just as how we find food, the different tree species and the different vegetation species have different levels of palatability. So if you get slightly lower densities of deer in some places, it will allow some things like alder and birch to establish and grow taller, but then the tastier things will remain at that field layer level.
Oh, it's not to taste very nice.
I ask them if you get very dense regeneration, of course, you can get a loss of diversity in the ground flora, can't you? So, there are pros and cons. Certainly when you take the grazing virtually right off, I've seen the ground flora diminished.
Yeah, so
It's interesting determining what the original was. And there was some genetic work done, wasn't there, showing difference between planted and native, but I don't know how far that went and how accurate it is and whether you considered using it.
yeah, so firstly, just in the regeneration, that sort of density thing, what we find whenever places have been allowed to recover, such as a lot of sites in Cairngorms, is that there will be a kind of a mosaic of habitats. So there will be patches where there's dense thickets, there's patches where trees can't establish that well. So it's a really patchy kind of a more natural landscape. So it's not that all ground flora is, stopped from growing or stopped from becoming as diverse again. It's more that it's a patchwork across the landscape, which is, yeah, preferable because there's greater diversity in that as well, structurally, as well as in terms of plants and trees. And for genetics, yes, we do. We take samples from all our old trees where they're in reach, and they go off to the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology outside of Edinburgh, and they add to their data source. So for genetics, in terms of the Wild Pine Project, they can only really rule out a site as wild pine. So even if they're coming back showing that they're of native origin, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are wild pine, because people have taken seeds from or native pine woods and planted them as plantations. And yeah, there's quite a good database for us to have a look at for that, and we are working with the team at UKCEH on that as well.
Ro had a question.
Yeah.
Yes, I was just going to say, have you got a feel at all for how the next stage of this is likely to go? Presumably, when you're going to survey these sites, you have to have some contact with the landowners and land managers. Do you get the impression that many of them will be interested in reducing their deer numbers to a low enough extent to allow regeneration to go on without fencing? And also, how many of these sites are also subject to crofting tenure? Because I believe when we went to Glenfinley not the October before last, with the Pinewoods conference, that was one of the, if I'm remembering correctly, it was also primary with a deer, but it was under crofting tenure, which is, people have a legal right to graze their livestock there, and it's quite difficult given the sort of historical background to consider trying to get them to stop.
Yeah, our Glenfionley is probably the only one. I mean, definitely in terms of what we've been made aware of for the crofting. That's not to say that potentially where landowners haven't really engaged as much, that they do have those sorts of tenures on their land that we're just not aware of at the minute. We are working with Scottish Forestry to try and push these sites to get recognised in the Caledonian Pinewood inventory. But as you know, that doesn't exactly afford them protection or make anything happen. We do have some sites where landowners are really keen to do something, but they so far are sort of in the minority, unfortunately. So yeah, we probably need something that makes it necessary to reduce deer numbers.
Need to change the whole mindset at a sort of nationwide level, I would say, but that's somewhat difficult to achieve.
Yeah, that's
that was
right.
a great talk, as really interesting. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Has anybody else got anything pressing to ask? I'm sure we can corner you on
Maria.
Maria.
It's really, really fun and interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Maria, do you have a question?
Thank you very much for really very inspiring talk. My question relates a little bit to what Ro was asking. If you would design a next phase, the next 3 years, how would it look like? What would be in it?
I think the Wild Pine project is it's a standalone kind of research data collection. This is what we have to work with, and we're making management recommendations with all of these reports as well. What is happening at the moment is that there has been a Pinewood partnership formed. So lots of the agencies and lots of NGOs have come together and sort of signed up to these kind of management principles and working towards positive action for Pinewoods. And this is something that's come from the Pinewood Conference, which was in 2024, end of 2024. So there are positive steps, and we do have somebody coming in to lead that partnership in April as well. So they will be looking at bringing people together, trying to make action happen as well, and hopefully further down the line as well, having somebody who is specifically employed to engage with landowners and push for change. But there also is that sort of element of prioritization that we have to look at as well. So we are bringing the findings from the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project together with the Wild Pine Project findings and saying these are our sites where it is absolutely critical that we have action like imminently, and sort of grouping together sites in terms of what the priority is for the sites. So it's not, we don't want to look at it in just sort of action where it's easiest to achieve, where it's easy to engage with landowners, usually in NGO sites or whatever. We want it to be in the places that matter the most, the places that are going to be lost if we don't intervene quick. Yeah, hopefully that answers.
Yes, it's interesting to see how you're going to prioritize the different sites. That was actually another question, like the threat level will be a part of that, but I would think that it would also be looking at the genetics. Are these some of the populations very genetically isolated? It will be interesting to see the priority scheme, and that will be part of this project and still the prioritization.
So the Wild Pine project is a kind of standalone, kind of gathering the evidence, and then it is set to finish whenever we have surveyed all of the sites and brought all of that information together into a final report. But that information is what's going to feed into this partnership and hopefully drive how that moves forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? If nothing happens, how long is it before we'd lose the sites altogether? Because it sounds like it's been several hundred years they've been deteriorating with the, with the increase in the deer numbers and the disinterest in landowners in the woodlands. When would they actually start vanishing completely? I mean, obviously some of them are almost away in terms of having living trees.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to say exactly. For a lot of the sites would probably continue to exist in the sense that there's going to be trees and the associated species, but only in those really steep, craggy gullies and ledges. There is a site that I'm working on, just a report at the minute, is it was hundreds and hundreds of hectares in the 1800s, but it has been felled for conifer plantations. Unfortunately, well, it's a double-edged sword, but lots of old trees survived within that plantation, but they are continuing to die, and this is that they're being lost like right now. This hundreds and hundreds of hectares have retreated into about 50 or so that are clinging on to crags and ravines. But there have been lots of old trees retained within the plantation that are dying every single year and retreat or causing the woodland to retreat very rapidly. But on these sort of more open sites, it's probably going to take a lot longer than that. But yeah, the earlier that we can intervene and get things looking better, then the more diversity we still have and the better seed source that we still have. So the greater potential that there is there for a good recovery.
Thanks.
Is global warming one of the things that's affecting regeneration?
Not that I'm aware of in terms of abundance or it's probably more in terms of where. So with climate change, the pine woods are likely to want to move up the slope as things get warmer and wetter. So they need to have that space in the landscape to be able to move up slope. So it'll be really important for the future of pine woods to have that mobility in the landscape. Obviously that runs out at a point because the hills are only so high. But yeah, I'm not aware of any of our tree species that are affected by climate change in terms of how well they can regenerate at the moment. I don't know if anybody else knows anything different.
Well, thanks very much, Jane, for the talk. It's been really interesting. I think everyone has agreed that. So thank you very much for a fascinating talk. And maybe you'll invite us in one of your forays to a bit of Pinewood over. I think we've got one in the calendar beside over the hill from Lochcarn, haven't we, for later on.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, everyone. Our next talk is in March, as Audrey said before, the 10th of March at the Smithton Church Hall. I can't remember what the subject is.
Ben Avery's talking about the rainforest, isn't it?
Oh, that's right. So another forest. So
follows on
hopefully
very well from this one, I should think, because some of the pinewoods are in the rainforest zone, but I think Ben might be more talking about oak woods and things like that.
I hope you can manage along to that one, Jane. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions.
I hope so. I'll put it in the diary.
So thanks everyone for coming on tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as Tessa and I have here. And hopefully we'll see you next month. Meantime, stay well and get out there.
Round of applause for Jane.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. See you soon.